Thank you, Brian. So Enigma wouldn't let me put the full-size title I wanted to put into this talk. So compliance is not equal to security, but we used it anyway, and improve the way we deliver DevOps security for Agile teams at scale. Now, that's a pretty big title, and I can see why they wouldn't let me use it. But I'm going to talk to you a bit today about the journey we went on in IBM Cloud. And it was really interesting to me to hear Tanya's AppSec talk because it actually dovetails a lot with what I'm going to talk to you about, which is really how we made huge changes to the way we deliver security, both in terms of staffing and approach to be able to keep up with the agile pace that our DevOps teams were pursuing. So I'm going to start with a conversation that might not be terribly alien to the security people in the room. And it starts a little bit something like this. A developer comes to you and says, hey, my product's ready for production. Can I have one of those cool compliance certifications, please? And you say, well, maybe. Have you followed the security guidance and read our secure engineering framework and followed the processes and applied for the certificates and got yourself in the queue? And they say, well, yeah, probably, but really, I just want the certificate that my project manager said I had to have. And that pretty generally results in the same sort of response from security, which is monumental face palms. And those sorts of conversations were happening more often than we'd like. And I think at any big organization that's making a transition towards developing things in agile ways, or in our case, very much focused on delivering things cloud first, cloud native, then it's a problem that's going to be faced by a lot of organizations. So I'm going to talk to you about the changes we made to go from where we were, which was a fairly typical corporate style centralized security team telling people what to do, to a process where we actually ended up bringing security people together, standardizing on one set of common controls, and then distributing that knowledge throughout all of our agile teams. Or in short, how we go from epic facepalm to happy Fonzie. And this really falls into two areas. We had to make changes to how we staffed and how we built. And when we looked at some of the challenges we were facing, we saw issues around acquisition, a lot around DevOps security, and some things around compliance limitations. And that'll bring us back to my discussion of why compliance is not equal to security. So in IBM, we have our own agile model within cloud. It shares a lot with what used to be known as the Spotify model. We have independent DevOps teams, squads of about 8 or so people. And they're responsible for designing, maintaining, building, and operating a service, all those nice DevOps things. You'll notice security wasn't one of the things I mentioned, and we're going to try and kind of shove that in there. These squads are self-sufficient, and they're grouped into tribes. So we have a compute tribe, we have a storage tribe, and such. So IBM is cranking good code constantly to improve our cloud, but we also have grown significantly through acquisitions. And acquisitions, it turns out, have varying degrees of security maturity within those organizations. Sometimes they don't even quite have a security engineer, or at least that guy didn't find out he was a security engineer until the day before the acquisition closed. Other times, like SoftLayer, they come with fully staffed 24/7 around the world security coverage. So there's a massive, massive gap that we have to span. Now, I'll talk to you for a moment about what Agile and what DevOps teams are made up of. There's always developers, sometimes systems engineers. Our automations guys and girls, those are the ones that really drive the DevOps story and allow us to push very, very regular changes into production. Offering manager or release manager, project manager, somebody who takes the requirements, has strong input into the direction that the project's going in. A security engineer, we need these people within every single squad because these are squads that are iterating extremely quickly. They are empowered to make their own choices about how they deliver a service. And that means we don't have a waterfall style process anymore. We don't have the ability to dump big security requirements in at one end and gate a security checklist at the end, at the other end. And we have experience assurance, so that's kind of the translation of what QA means for our cycles. And as I mentioned before, we group these people into tribes, and they have tribe leaders. So a good example of where security is working well is where we have established service security squads, like whole squads of people just dedicated to security, or where we have very established teams who've got good, stable products, and they've got a couple of people working in security who've maybe transitioned to that role, or they were hired in order to do it. But what you'll often find when you're building very quickly and hiring aggressively is you can't always find the security people you need to put into all of these individual squads. And with squads that are sort of 8 people anyway, we can't necessarily always staff every single one with a security engineer because there aren't enough to go around. So this was one of the big challenges that we have to understand, and one of the main drivers for our change, which was to understand how we enable these small squads with limited security capabilities to be able to derive the same levels of security assurance from their services that more established services with dedicated security teams already had. With that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the short version of the title for my talk. So compliance is not equal to security. How do we make IT less scary? We prove we know what we're doing, we demonstrate best practices. That's really what compliance is. Big checklists of things we have to do, processes we have to show we've adhered to in order to demonstrate that we're secure, for some value of the word secure. So will compliance save us? Well, let's explore this. I've discussed some of the challenges we have in our Agile teams. So let's take these different squads. Let's get them doing compliance. Now, we need to pick a couple of good standards, and I'm sure you'd all love to shout some out, but I'll arbitrarily pick 2 because I know how big they are. Let's pick PCI because we decide we want to do commerce. And let's pick NIST 853, which is something I'll come back to. It was great to hear Tanya call that out, because we just tell people to do NIST, but that's fine. Let's take those 2 standards, and we're going to give them to these teams. So there's an interesting phenomenon that happens when you drop 700 pages of documentation and requirements on Agile teams. The first one is indifference. It's surprising how many other shiny things start gaining people's attention and how security requirements continuously get shuffled to the back of a development queue. So maybe then you escalate and you have to talk to their tribe leaders or something like that, and maybe then you get an anger response back. Now, I can't possibly do this. I'm here to work on an interesting product to solve problems for my customers, not to satisfy your ridiculous documentation requirements. Denial often follows. Can't do it, we'll break the product, not a possibility. And these are all understandable reactions, but the most worrisome one is probably this one. We all know how hard it is to hire not just good security people, but good DevOps engineers. And turning around to really capable teams and bogging them down in hundreds of pages of compliance requirements is a really good way to provide them with incentive to go work somewhere else. So how do we make compliance accessible? We know we need compliance certifications. Customers tell us, the industry requires it. There are a lot of things that we need to do. So how do we make it accessible? And how do we enable these teams to keep working in the Agile way they do? At this point, I'm going to stop. I'm going to take a breath. And I'm going to invite you in the audience to participate in this pop quiz, just in your mind, please. I'm going to ask you what 2 things all these companies and organizations have in common. Okay, 2 things. There's 2 points available. I don't have any candies to give you, unfortunately, but okay. So if you guessed compliance, you'd be right. Every single one of those organizations shares at least one of these compliance certifications or follows one of these bodies of guidance. If you guessed that every single one of them was in the major technical and non-technical press in the last 2 years for massive data breaches, you'd also be right. So how is it that we have these 2 situations? How can we have these teams, these products, these companies where they have all the certifications they said they needed, or they were told by industry that they needed, but they're still getting breached left and right? I think it comes down to some misconceptions about compliance. So I think this is how a lot of people see compliance. You know, we've got razor wire, electric fence, Fort Knox. We've done everything that these 700 pages, perhaps, documentation say we need to do. That means we're secure, right? We've ticked all the boxes. This is more how I see compliance. At some point, there was a requirement that there had to be a barrier between 2 areas. Somebody put a barrier in, they ticked the box, they met the compliance requirement. Unfortunately, that requirement, interpreted on its own, didn't allow for unexpected user behavior or possibly anticipated but not protected against attacker behaviors. They met the requirement, but still they were exploited. And compliance isn't all bad. So compliance is very useful for controls-based planning and for providing us with useful documentation and helping orientate our processes so we're doing good, repeatable things that we can see in different areas of industry. But it's not great for helping us to actually enforce security or for helping us drive any sort of technical innovation. So how do we take those good parts and use them to help solve our agile developer problem that I discussed earlier? You know, we need to understand what these limitations are and make compliance work for us. That means for me, how do we build security for cloud native if compliance isn't the answer? And that's kind of a loaded question because I know that actually we use compliance for a lot of good things. I mentioned before that we had to make changes to how we staffed and how we built. And we needed a good common set of controls to build that around. And what we did was to turn the way compliance often happens on its head. So instead of compliance being the end game that we would get to after we kind of built a product and tried to get it out the door, what if we took a really good superset of common compliance requirements that we know we're going to need and learned how to build products that embodied most of the good qualities from those control sets at the start? And then how do we turn that into something that works in our agile methods? So we picked NIST 853 as a standard to look at to work out how we're going to build towards. We picked 853 and actually revision 5, which is in draft, so please nobody change it too much. And we picked revision 5 because it's got a lot of stuff that applies more to cloud. It's got a lot of good privacy stuff that was previously in appendices, but it's now pulled into the main body of the document. It allows us to customize a few things, and it has a variable maturity model that allows us to apply different standards to different teams. So let's talk about people. I mentioned that we've got some areas where we've got very well-established teams. We've got other areas where people are struggling to bring in talent. What we did was actually to bring all of these security teams together into one bigger group of experts. Now, that is a very, very big herd of cats, and we needed to make sure that we were going to orchestrate things appropriately to make sure that we could deliver on some of these NIST things. So we brought people together from various different areas of cloud, various different areas of differing capability. And what we did was we started to make them responsible for individual control families under NIST. So NIST 853 defines 20 control families, around about 120 primary controls, and 250 secondary controls and extra guidance. And this is just a little slice. So we took these people and made them directly responsible for how these controls were delivered within our organization. For the entire stack, everything from sort of edge computing and serverless right down to IaaS, bare metal. They had to understand how access control, for the top example here, was implemented at every single layer, and have strong opinions about how it should be implemented, and actually take that further. So we took these groups of people, and their involvement with the different control families really fell into two areas. They were either focused on control expertise, so they had a very, very strong opinion about how a control should be delivered, and had defined a way to measure it. We do work with Agile teams, and we're not going to force them to necessarily do the thing that we think is best, as long as they can provide measurements and attestations that they meet our requirements. And functional delivery goes hand in hand with that. That basically takes it a step further, where we have our own Agile teams that produce centralized services for these squads that are struggling with security to consume and deliver in a fairly unified way. I mentioned earlier about that we had a mechanism to take this centralized effort and distribute it out across all these teams. And we did that through adding two new roles. We added the role of a security focal and the role of a tribe security leader. The security focal is a part-time role. They're really the security representative or evangelist within an individual squad. We didn't find it was too hard to hire for, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the tribe security leader is an interesting role, because that's a very senior member of technical staff who sits alongside a tribe leader, and they really own security for their segment of the portfolio. They're responsible for making sure their security focals are enabled to do what they need to do. So to reiterate, tribe security leader owns their whole segment from a security point of view, and security focals are how we distribute security knowledge and engagement through the individual squads. So our revised org chart looks a bit more like this, where we don't have many dedicated security people living inside squads. We will have security-specific services. So our key management team is obviously full of crypto experts, and our object storage teams are also full of crypto experts. And we've got lots of distributed crypto talent. But security focals, basically, they know how we're seeing the world in terms of NIST. They understand where these controls lie. They're able to evangelize those within their team, and they're able to go to either our central team or through their tribe security leader when they run into problems. They're basically our touch point within all the individual squads. So that's how we have currently structured ourselves. And I'll get onto the results in a moment. But there were a couple of interesting lessons we learned as we completely changed the way we approach this. And although this is an enterprise talk, I've tried to avoid using the word reorg at all. But we very much changed our structure and brought people together. We learned that not everybody wants to be a security focal, which was a big surprise to me because I think security is awesome. But it turns out some people actually like building products people use. So there was a challenge. It was interesting hearing Marsha's talk this morning from Elevate Security on motivation versus ability. And there's some interesting things around sort of security championing programs and that sort of thing that we've used to help incentivize people to go in the right direction. NIST is a really, really big standard. You should make sure that more than 2 people in your company have read the entire thing front to back before you decide to make a major strategic change based on that standard. The focus must always be on developers. And this point here at the bottom, I've heard a lot this week, which is secure the path of least resistance. Or to phrase it slightly differently, the easiest way to do something has to be the most secure. So really that's what our functional delivery people do all the time. And I'll give you a great example of what I mean there, which is to say that take certificate management for an organization, right? Companies regularly get on the front page of the press because everything went down because somebody forgot to replace a certificate. We made tools that made it easier to manage your certificates for your entire CI and DevOps pipelines than it was to Google how to make a self-signed cert. Right? Path of least resistance, make it the most secure way. Developers will quite happily follow you down there. So this is my very metrics-heavy diagram of our results in this process. It all comes back to this consolidation effort, really. The fact that we brought all these people together allowed us to really benefit from true full-stack visibility from a security point of view. You know, when you're looking at any big cloud company, the stack is too big for any one person to keep in their mind. But we found actually by bringing all this talent together that had very deep understanding of these various levels, not only did we get good cross-pollination of ideas and the ability to adapt best-in-breed tooling and those sorts of things, but it also accelerated things like our penetration testing abilities, our incident response capabilities, and those sorts of things. One of the elements here I'm most proud of actually is the security career path. So IBM obviously is a very big company. It has an entire security arm that you can go and do security things. But if you're passionate about cloud and passionate about security, there wasn't really a good way that you could pursue both of those things previously. And now, because we've brought people together into one place rather than being distributed, we're actually in a position where we can give people a way to go from being a security focal, contributing to the security posture of an individual squad, to becoming sort of an enterprise security architect and delivering visions of what security should be like in the future. And what this has all led us to is enabled developers. So we're no longer having those painful conversations around what it means for compliance, around all the extra work that needs to be done to deliver compliance requirement X or Y. And that's because we chose a very big standard in 853, but that it overlapped so nicely with so many different elements on our compliance roadmap that it allowed us to provide a much more seamless experience for our developers who were trying to make their way along that. So the results were happier developers, no longer getting requirements dropped on them, no longer confused about what security meant for them at their level of the stack. Happy security focals, on the lookout for security problems, letting the developers get on with what they needed to do. And obviously a much, much happier security team. So what's next? It'd be interesting to see which other standards would work. I mentioned NIST is a very big standard. I'm fortunate in that we have a very big security team. It wouldn't work for somebody who was trying to build this around a single product because you just wouldn't have the people to cover it. Where are the DevSecOps tools? I've tried not to use that term because I'm still not entirely sure that that is the right term we're going to use, but definitely there is an intersection of security and DevOps that is going to be very interesting to work in. This whole idea of security as code and how that will feed into our processes and our functional delivery teams especially is something we're extremely interested to explore. And the last point, which comes back to control measurement, which I mentioned earlier, is how much can we really measure? At a certain point, security becomes qualitative as opposed to quantitative. At a certain point, we cannot do metrics for things. We still have security reviews. We still have threat models. Then they're a manual process, and they get done by specialized teams that supplement the requirements we follow through NIST. So that was my talk. Thank you very much.